Pursuant to the provisions of Clause 5 of Rule 1, the Chair announces that she will postpone further proceedings today on each motion to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the vote is objected to under Clause 4 of Rule 15. Such roll call votes, if postponed, will be taken after debate has concluded on all motions to suspend the rules, but not before 5 p.m. today. Gentleman from Illinois.
Madam Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1023 as amended.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1023, a bill to provide compassionate payments with regard to individuals with blood clotting disorders such as hemophilia who contracted human immunodeficiency virus due to contaminated blood products and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Hyde, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 23, the RickyRay Hemophilia Relief Fund Act of 1998. This legislation has 270 co-sponsors in the House, including our distinguished Speaker, and I am informed the Minority Leader also supports this legislation. When communities in our great nation are devastated by a natural disaster such as floods or tornadoes, we rush to their aid, as well we should. The hemophilia community has been devastated by another type of natural disaster, the HIV contamination of the blood clotting products which they need to treat their hemophilia. This legislation provides the disaster relief necessary to assist this community through a very difficult time. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, half of all people with blood clotting disorders in the United States were infected with HIV due to their use of blood clotting products which were on the market at that time. During this period, people with blood clotting disorders needed to use these products to live a relatively normal life, and because each dose came from a pool of thousands of blood donors, it was almost certain that they would become HIV infected. However, at that time, HIV had not been identified, and no tests were available to detect its presence. Most people with blood clotting disorders are already financially strapped by the medical costs they incur to treat their disorder, with yearly medical costs of over $150,000 and the added tragedy of an HIV infection. These families have been emotionally and financially devastated. In cases involving other types of blood and blood products, such as transfusion cases, where a primary provider or a small child was infected, settlements usually were for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Many of the HIV-infected people with hemophilia were young fathers and children. After many years of litigation, the manufacturers of these blood-clotting products containing HIV have set up a fund which provides $100,000 to individuals and their families. However, when considering the incredible financial burden placed on these families due to medical costs and, in many cases, loss of the primary provider in the family, this amount will not sufficiently lift this community out of the financial crisis that has developed. While no amount will completely alleviate the losses felt, H.R. 1023 provides a payment equal to that of the industry. The amount available to these families would then be comparable to that potentially realized by other HIV-infected blood victims through settlement. There is a manager's amendment to this legislation. The bill, as reported by the committee, included a provision of no more than 2% of these payments that may be used for attorney's fees. Concern was raised during committee consideration that should there be a complication in the processing of an individual's application, 2% would be insufficient. To address that concern, the 2% limitation on attorney's fees has been increased to 5%. I know my budget-conscious colleagues may balk at this expenditure, but when an extreme crisis hits an American community, we should, as a nation, respond to that community's need, and that's what this bill does. To aid this community in crisis, I urge a favorable vote on H.R. 1023, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I rise in support of H.R. 1023, the RickyRay Hemophilia Relief Fund Act of 1998. The purpose of the bill is to establish a fund to provide compassionate payments of $100,000 to individuals with hemophilia who contracted HIV, the AIDS virus, from contaminated blood clotting products. Hemophilia is a blood clotting disorder genetically passed to sons by their mothers. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, approximately 7,200 boys and men were affected with HIV through the use of blood clotting products. That's nearly half of all people with hemophilia in the United States. Because these blood clotting products were derived from pools made up of literally thousands of donors, including prisoners, it has been nearly impossible to prove causation and assign liability to any one manufacturer for selling contaminated blood products. Although, as the chairman mentioned, many cases have been settled, of the dozen or so cases that eventually went to trial, the manufacturers were only held liable in 2 cases, one of which was reversed and the other is still on appeal. To make matters worse, many of the states have passed so-called blood shield laws to protect blood banks from liability when blood-based diseases are passed on to users. Notwithstanding the industry's courtroom success and new blood shield laws, the industry recently established a fund to provide $100,000 to individuals who contracted HIV through contaminated blood clotting products in exchange for signing waivers releasing the industry of any future liability. Many hemophiliacs and their families have accepted this offer. Unfortunately, the $100,000 industry payment is insufficient to cover the enormous cost of blood clotting drugs which people with hemophilia must continue to use in order to live a relatively normal life, and the enormous cost of drugs to combat the AIDS virus. Accordingly, this legislation is necessary to provide additional financial assistance. The administration supports this proposal. We want to thank the chairman for the manager's amendment to increase the attorney's fee provision from 2 to 5%, because we support this amendment because we believe that it will allow claimants greater access to legal counsel in processing their applications under the bill. With that, Madam Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of this time. The gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 8 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Florida and one of the driving forces behind this excellent legislation, Mr. Porter Goss.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 8 minutes. Without objection.
I thank the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Henry Hyde, Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, for whom I have great respect, and I thank him personally from my heart for his help in getting this legislation this far. I rise today in support of H.R. 1023, the RickyRay Hemophilia Relief Fund Act, which is designed to respond to the tragedy of hemophilia-associated AIDS. I first became involved in this issue some 9 years ago when I met the Ray family. Ricky Ray, like his 2 brothers, contracted HIV through the use of contaminated blood products. Ricky, the eldest of the 3 boys, died of AIDS in 1992 at the age of 15. Before his death, Ricky and his family courageously spoke out and became national symbols of the terrible situation we're facing. He inspired many of his peers to tell their stories and begin seeking answers from the federal government and the blood product manufacturing industry. I'm saddened that he did not live to see the day when legislation named in his honor would win the approval of this body. But we know his brothers, his sisters, parents, and the extended family of friends he established around the country recognize the enormous contribution that he made in his very short life. It is appropriate that the legislation before us bears his name, and I'm pleased that Ricky's mother, Louise, is here with us today. Madam Speaker, hemophilia is an inherited blood clotting disorder causing serious internal bleeding episodes that, if left untreated, can lead to disfigurement and death. People with hemophilia rely on blood products, commonly called factor, which are manufactured and sold by pharmaceutical companies. Because these products are made from the pooled blood of thousands of people, the potential for infection with a blood-borne disease among them who use them is obviously very high, something that has been known for decades. In fact, hemophilia sufferers have long been described as the canaries in the coal mine, because when something goes wrong with the blood supply, it shows up in the hemophilia community first. Soon after the introduction of clotting factor in the 1970s, the hepatitis virus swept through the hemophilia community. Largely as a result of the hemophilia community's experience with the hepatitis virus, the federal government adopted the National Blood Policy, which charged the Public Health Service, including the Center for Disease Control, Food and Drug, the National Institute of Health, with ensuring the safety and adequacy of the nation's blood supply. It is worth noting that the federal responsibility for blood and blood products is indeed unique. No other product has a national policy. In the early 1980s, a much more deadly villain struck, as approximately one-half of the nation's hemophiliacs, some 7,200 people at a minimum, became infected with HIV through the use of contaminated blood products. How did this happen? Why did the system that was established to safeguard the supply of blood and blood products fail to heed the early warning signs and prove so slow to respond to a dangerous threat? In 1993, I joined with Senators Graham of Florida and Kennedy of Massachusetts in asking the Department of Health and Human Services to conduct a review of the events surrounding this medical disaster. The results of that intensive and objective review are contained in a report prepared by the Institute of Medicine, an arm of the National Academy of Sciences. The IOM found, quote, a failure of leadership and inadequate institutional decision-making processes, unquote, in the system responsible for ensuring blood safety, concluding that, quote, a failure of leadership led to less than effective donor screening, weak regulatory actions, and insufficient communication to patients about the risk of AIDS, unquote. While the IOM report is important, it doesn't begin to quantify the human dimension. For me, that's the most compelling part of this tragedy. You cannot talk to these victims without being moved by what they've gone through. It's important to keep in mind that the people with hemophilia already have to manage a sometimes debilitating disease. The average person with hemophilia spends approximately $100,000 per year on clotting factor alone. Many people with hemophilia have had a difficult time obtaining both health and life insurance, understandably. In addition to the difficulties associated with hemophilia itself, the added complication of HIV/AIDS has hit the hemophilia community particularly hard. AIDS treatment costs somewhere in the range of $10,000 to $50,000 per year, varying on the stage of the disease and the course of the treatment. As a result of these extraordinary costs and the disproportionate impact of this tragedy on men, who most typically suffer from hemophilia and who tended to be the head of many of these households, many of these folks have been financially devastated. In some cases, entire generations have been wiped out: fathers, sons, uncles. Most tragically, some men infected their wives with HIV before they became aware that they had contracted the disease. We know of cases where unborn children in these circumstances were also infected. The emotional toll on all of these families has been immense. Madam Speaker, the federal government cannot become involved in every tragic case that occurs in this country. But this case is unique, and I believe the federal government can and should, for compassionate reasons, act to help the hemophilia community. While we cannot right all the wrongs in the world, we should pass this legislation to acknowledge the unique responsibility of the government to protect the blood supply and provide some measure of compassionate assistance to these victims. While I am encouraged that a final class settlement between the people with hemophilia and the blood product manufacturing companies is in fact going forward, it does not change my view that government also must act. As my colleagues know, and as the hemophilia community has learned firsthand, moving a bill through the legislative process is a slow, difficult, and sometimes frustrating experience. Amen. When I first introduced the RickyRay bill, we had about 24 co-sponsors. Since then, support for the bill has swelled to 270 co-sponsors, and we have secured unanimous approval for all three committees with jurisdiction. This incredible progress is the direct result of the courage, diligence, and hard work of the hemophilia community. Of particular note is the work of a group of high school students from Robinson Secondary School in Fairfax, Virginia. For several years, these kids, part of a marketing education program called DECA, have lobbied to pass this bill. Their efforts have been extraordinary, and they show that democracy can and does work. Finally, Madam Speaker, let me say thank you to the congressional staff that have worked with me through the years to research and understand this tragedy, explain it to the House, and get this bill moving. Madam Speaker, for too long the hemophilia community has felt the government first let them down and later abandoned them. I sincerely hope that the House action today will provide some measure of reassurance that their voices do count, that the legislative process does work, and that we have not forgotten them or the tragedy that befell their community. I only wish we had a cure for AIDS. I strongly urge my colleagues to support this important legislation, and I would ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks and include extraneous material in the record. I yield
Without objection. Gentleman's time. Gentleman yields back balance. This time, gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield such time as he may consume to the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Delahunt.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I too rise in strong support of H.R. 1023, the RickyRay Hemophilia Relief Fund Act. And before I begin my statement, I want to acknowledge and commend the fine work of my colleague from Florida, Mr. Porter Goss. He has truly provided outstanding leadership in this particular issue. Let me ask you to imagine that you're the parent of 3 fine sons, each of whom has inherited the gene for hemophilia. Now imagine, if you can, that each of your sons acquires the AIDS virus through a contaminated blood transfusion. 2 brothers die before age 40, and the third is very sick. Among them, they have 9 children, your grandchildren, all of whom will be left fatherless. At least one family in my district does not have to imagine what that would be like, Madam Speaker. They know, because this is precisely what is happening to them. Nor is their heartbreaking story, unfortunately, unique. I have received letters from people in Abington, Weymouth, Duxbury, and other towns throughout Massachusetts who have lost family members and friends to hemophilia-associated AIDS. Every death from AIDS is a tragedy that touches many lives. Yet, who can fathom the sheer devastation that is visited on families such as these? The enormity of their experience becomes still more compelling when one learns that the government, our government, could have acted to prevent it. In 1980, when the first Americans began to fall ill from the mysterious ailment that would ultimately be called AIDS, the technology became available to pasteurize blood clotting agents. Yet for 7 years, the government failed to require the blood products industry to make use of this technology. Nor did the government require the industry to inform the public about the risks of contamination with HIV and other blood-borne pathogens. As a result, at least 8,000 people with hemophilia and other blood clotting disorders contracted HIV/AIDS from transfusions of contaminated anti-familial factor, or HAF, between 1980 and 1987. This means that as many as 50% of all individuals who suffer from blood clotting disorders were exposed to HIV through their use of AHF. In 1995, an independent scientific review conducted by the Institute of Medicine concluded that this tragedy occurred because the government failed to take the steps that could have prevented it. Some might argue that we cannot afford to do anything about that, but I believe we have an obligation to acknowledge what happened and make restitution to the victims of this disaster and their families. This bill will not compensate them for the terrible harm that was done to them, nor will it begin to cover their medical costs. But it will mean a great deal to them to know that their country has not abandoned them. I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of this bill and urge all of my colleagues to join in supporting it today. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Illinois.
I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Hayward.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the Speaker, and I thank my colleague from Florida, Mr. Goss, for his hard work on this legislation. And Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to come to the well today to speak in behalf of passage of this legislation because, Madam Speaker, I had a chance to listen to a young man from my state recount the very real difficulties that he confronted from receiving a transfusion of HIV-tainted blood. His name, Jeremy Storms. Jeremy lived the scriptures in which he so fervently believed. He let his light shine among men. And despite all the medical difficulties he encountered, many times he traveled here to Washington to tell us of the challenges he faced. He had a wisdom beyond his years. He would joke, "You know, I used to be upset that I was a hemophiliac. Now I wish it was the only problem I had." Jeremy passed away a few short months ago. I ask unanimous consent for additional 30 seconds.
30 seconds, please.
I thank my colleague from Illinois. Jeremy passed away a few months ago, but he did not live in vain. And for his mother and father and family, and for countless other families, this House, on this day, at this hour, acknowledges the role of the federal government in public health and, yes, in personal responsibility. So I would urge this body, adopt this legislation in memory of Ricky Ray, Jeremy Storms, and so many others. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Johnson.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of this bill. Having functioned as a registered professional nurse, I've observed over the years persons who are afflicted and need frequent infusions are more subjected to the risk of HIV than others on a normal basis. This has been one of the viruses that has come along in our history that we've not found any way to conquer it, that we must always be mindful of. Nothing is more important than assuring a family that when they have a loved one that needs a transfusion, it is free of viruses and any other bacteria. We've gone a long ways in that. We've had to deal with the virus of the 30s for pneumonia and the virus of polio for the 50s, and now we're having to deal with another major virus, the HIV virus. So many people. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you. So many people are so unaware of their risk for this disease, for the disease of which the virus will cause. We must do all that we can to protect the general public, and this bill goes a long ways in protecting the hemophiliacs because they cannot get around having the transfusions. I've observed too many families, heterosexual intact families, be destroyed by contamination from the young children and some young adults getting transfusions, blood transfusions. I do think, and I agree with the gentleman, that there is a public health responsibility of our federal government, and this is one of those major issues that until we find medical breakthroughs, we as a government need to take the responsibility of ensuring that the availability of safe, virus-free blood is available. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Illinois.
The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis, is recognized for 3 minutes.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, I, too, rise in strong support of H.R. 1023. First and foremost, I want to commend my Florida colleague, Porter Gus, for his tireless efforts to secure passage of this important measure. As chairman of the Commerce Subcommittee on Health and the Environment, I am pleased to be an original co-sponsor of the bill. As my colleagues have already noted, H.R. 1023 provides compassionate payments to individuals with blood clotting disorders who contracted HIV due to contaminated blood products. The National Hemophilia Foundation estimates that nearly 8,000 individuals with hemophilia contracted HIV from the nation's blood supply, which became contaminated before the identification of and development of tests to detect its presence. These individuals and their families were already burdened by the medical costs of treating their blood clotting disorders, and many have been financially devastated by the costs associated with HIV infection. This is a tragedy, and I share the Foundation's view that passage of this bill will serve to rebuild trust in the federal government in its essential role of protecting the U.S. blood supply and blood products. A number of my constituents, including Margie and Johnny Kellar of Palm Harbor, have contacted me to urge enactment of this critical legislation. I share the desire to secure prompt passage of the bill, and I'm pleased that the House is considering it today under suspension of the rules. As you know, Madam Speaker, provisions of H.R. 1023, which fall within the jurisdiction of the House Commerce Committee, were enacted last year as part of the balanced budget law. Those provisions exempted the private settlement funds from the calculation of income for the purposes of determining Medicaid eligibility. This language was designed to ensure that those who accepted the private settlement would not lose their eligibility under the Medicaid program. My Health and Environment Subcommittee has jurisdiction over the Medicaid provisions, and I was pleased to secure their enactment as part of the 1997 balanced budget law. The measure before us today extends similar protections to recipients of supplemental security income benefits. Again, I want to commend Congressman Goss for his leadership on this issue and his diligent efforts in bringing H.R. 1023 to the floor, and I urge all of my colleagues to lend their wholehearted support to passage of this important bill. Thank you. I yield back, Madam
Gentleman
Speaker.
yields back. Gentleman from Virginia.
Madam Speaker, I'm expecting another speaker that may appear, so I'd like to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman
Madam
from
Speaker,
Illinois.
may I inquire how much time we have left?
Gentleman from Illinois has 5 minutes remaining.
Thank you. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Congressman Cliff Stearns.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I thank my colleague, and I commend my colleague, Porter Goss from Florida, for his vigilance in getting this legislation to the floor. I also am a original co-sponsor of the RickyRay Relief Act. I'm deeply committed to seeing this bill become public law. Madam Speaker, my involvement in this issue began back in 1994 when I, too, was contacted by Gail and Randy Ellman. The Ellmans lost their son, Eric Brandon, when he was 14 years old. Eric died as a result of infusing a clotting factor that was tainted with HIV. His death is a double tragedy because it could have been avoided. While we cannot bring back Ricky or Eric, we can try today to rectify this wrong. According to best estimates, about 8,000 hemophiliacs have been infected with HIV. This represents half the hemophiliacs in the country. By passing this bill, we are simply saying that we acknowledge the government's failure through the FDA to protect our nation's blood supply and regulate the sale of blood products. Would $100,000 make up for the pain and suffering these families had to endure? The answer is no. But what it will do is say to thousands of people so deeply affected by this tragedy that your government wants to right the wrong. The Ellmans called my office this morning to express their heartfelt gratitude for my support for this legislation and for my other colleagues' support. I say to the Ellmans and the many other families so devastated by what has happened to them, it is the very least we can do. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Virginia has 11 and a half minutes remaining.
I'd like to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman
I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Davis.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Ask the consent to revise it.
That objection.
Mr. Chairman, I rise today to voice my strong support for H.R. 1023, the RickyRay Hemophilia Relief Fund Act. As an original co-sponsor in both this Congress and the 104th Congress, I'm enormously proud that we have been able to bring this bill to the floor in a bipartisan manner with the support and co-sponsorship of over 270 members. Congressman Goss has done a tremendous job in garnering support for the RickyRay Act and ensuring that it come before the full House today. And I also express my appreciation to the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Hyde, as well. I also want to recognize the hard work of the students at Robinson Secondary School in Fairfax, Virginia, on behalf of the thousands of hemophiliacs suffering from AIDS. They have dedicated themselves over the past couple of years to winning passage of this legislation and are now witnessing that democracy does work. As many of you know, this legislation is named for Ricky Ray, a young boy from Florida who died in 1992 of hemophilia-related AIDS that he contracted through the use of blood clotting products. Approximately 1/2 of all hemophilia sufferers were infected with HIV through the use of blood clotting products between 1980 and 1987. The federal government has a shared responsibility for this tragedy because it failed to fulfill its responsibility to protect the nation's blood supply and to regulate the safety of blood products. The Ricky Ray bill gives a one-time payment of $100,000 each to about 7,200 hemophiliacs, about half of whom are still surviving, who were infected with the AIDS virus from blood clotting agents between July 1, 1982 and December 31, 1987. It also implements a sunset provision after 5 years from the date of the bill's enactment. Passage of this legislation will mark a defining and critical moment in the lives of many innocent AIDS sufferers, not because of the relatively small amount of money they receive, but because of the peace they and their families will have in knowing that their government has taken responsibility for what happened to them and in attempting to compensate them for suffering to the extent that we are able to do so. I strongly urge all of my colleagues to vote in favor of the Ricky Ray bill.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia.
Madam Speaker, I yield 4 minutes to the lady from California, Ms. Pelosi.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my colleague for yielding and rise in strong support of the Ricky Ray Hemophilia Relief Fund Act. And I want to commend our colleague, Representative Porter Goss, for his leadership and compassion in bringing this legislation to the floor as a sponsor of this bill. The life of the boy who gave his name to this legislation should remind all of us of the many different tragedies and demonstrations of courage and compassion the AIDS epidemic has brought us. In his short life, Ricky witnessed the prejudice and fear which surrounded hemophilia AIDS, particularly in its first decade, but which is still all too common today. He had hemophilia, as you know, but he contracted AIDS and was the victim of much discrimination. He and his family watched their home burn down because neighbors were afraid of his illness. His family struggled with the tremendous financial burden of providing for a child with hemophilia and AIDS. Ricky's parents saw their son pass away as they confronted the limits of treatment to fight the HIV disease. Each of these aspects of Ricky's lives are important to remember today. The prejudice, the crushing financial burden, the hope for cures which have yet to come, and the inspiring courage and compassion of this young man, his family, and friends. This was Ricky's story, and it is the story of thousands of other people, many of whom have died. Many are living today with hemophilia, HIV, and AIDS. The resources that Congress can provide will not solve the tragedy of hemophilia and AIDS for Ricky Ray and others like him, but they will help individuals, families, and communities begin to recover from the calamity that has befallen them. Whether the federal government acted appropriately to protect blood clotting products in the 1980s is not the issue today. At issue now is providing assistance to individuals and families who have been forced to confront a personal and financial crisis brought by two debilitating diseases. The federal government must do many things to respond to the AIDS epidemic and to hemophilia. It must protect the nation's blood supply, provide prevention interventions in case of HIV/AIDS, fund research to find a cure and a vaccine, and support health care and needed services for those who are ill. But as with other major catastrophes, the federal government also must provide the resources which help families and communities take the first steps toward recovery. For that, I am grateful to Mr. Goss for his leadership, to my colleague, Mr. Scott, for his participation in this, as well as Mr. Hyde and others, and I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1023. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield back my balance of my time to my...
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from Illinois.
I have no further speakers, and I'm pleased to yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance this time. Gentleman from Virginia.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself such time as may consume. Just to thank Mr. Goss for his hard work on this, Mr. Hyde for his leadership, and Mr. Watt, gentleman from North Carolina, whose subcommittee considered this. And at that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1023 as amended? So many as are in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 of those present having voted in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, the title is amended. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise?
Madam Speaker, I move the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 3039 as amended.
Clerk will report the title.